But tonight we will be discussing and talking about the ministers of what we call the English Reformation. The 5 men that I've chosen for this purpose tonight are 5 of very significant men, all of which laid down their lives for the gospel. Is that recording, Cliff?
Yeah.
Oh, that's good. Just thought about that. The 40 years from 1516 to 1556, during which these men followed Christ, were years in which the English Reformation was cradled and nurtured for the glory of God. The first is Thomas Bilney. Thomas Bilney was born about the year 1495. Again, a lot of these men, they don't know exactly their birth years. They kind of guesstimate and they can get around close proximity. He was either born in the village of East Bilney or Norwich itself. Very little is known in regards to his home or his childhood. There are gaps in all the biographies because they simply don't know a lot about his childhood. We do know that he was a lover of books. And as it so goes, when you get a kid who's a lover of books, he loves to learn and he's usually intelligent. So it was with Bilney. And while we do not know exactly when his studies began, we do know that eventually he became a student at the University of Cambridge. He eventually settled into studying law and made rapid progress, and he graduated in 1520 with his law degree from Cambridge University. He was ordained as a priest in 1519 before he got his degree, and he became a fellow of Trinity Hall at Cambridge apparently around the same time. In the meantime, the Lord was beginning to set the stage for the English Reformation. Erasmus had published this New Testament in Greek from the Hebrew, from the Latin. So he had it was 2 columns. It had Latin on one side and Greek on the other. So God had got that going. Zwingli had made his appeal to the supreme authority of Scripture. Luther had nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the Castle Church. And books and writings were seeping into England. Bilney, like so many other converts to the true gospel, began to endure great torment under the burden of his sin. Much like Martin Luther, when he began looking at himself and looking at his sin and then tried to look to the Catholic Church for the remedy to that sin, it was not found. Bilney had heard so much talk of this notorious translation of Erasmus that he eventually bought a copy of it, smuggled it into his room in Cambridge, because it was an outlawed book, smuggled it into his room. As he opened the book, Bilney's eyes fell upon 1 Timothy 1:15. The saying is trustworthy and deserving of full acceptance, that Jesus Christ came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am the foremost. At that moment, the Holy Spirit began to move in Thomas Bilney's heart. He applied that truth to himself. He said, I also am like Paul, and more than Paul, the greatest of sinners. But, he said, Christ saves sinners. He was liberated from his guilt. And now being liberated and saved and forgiven completely, he poured himself into Erasmus' translation of the Bible, eventually exclaiming, a new time is beginning. The Christian assembly is about to be renewed. He started a Bible study group at Cambridge, began teaching the true gospel and influencing young men who loved to hear him teach. Bilney took to open-air preaching in 1527, which soon attracted the attention of the priest and the friars, and they took every opportunity to ridicule his teaching and correct him, even at times dragging him from the pulpit in the middle of his message. While preaching on May 28, 1527, he was arrested and brought before the bishop's court in Westminster. He was given a choice: stop preaching or die at the stake. The Bishop of Tunstall of London, who had control of the meetings, did not want him to die and tried to persuade him to recant. For 2 days, under intense pressure from Tunstall, Billy, confused and weary of mind, recanted, believing that his friends had better judgment than him. Friends came in as well and began to persuade him. And they basically told him, Billy, listen, recant, and then you can go on and keep doing work for God. You could save your life and continue serving God if you'll just recant of these new things you believe. He did, and he was paraded in humiliation in front of the council, and he was put in prison to pay penance for his sins of preaching the gospel. While in prison, he was filled with remorse over his decision to recant, and for 2 years while he dwelt in prison, the worst part of the torture was his own conscience. Far more, he said, than the Catholic Church. After being out of prison for a year, they said he went through a deep time of depression. He was lit up, and I quote, like one rising from the dead. He told his friends that they would never see him again. And off he went, headed to Norfolk to preach the gospel. Now, fearing nothing, he preached. He distributed New Testaments and challenged the false doctrine of Rome. And it was not long before he was once again arrested and sent to London for execution. On the night that he was to be killed, witnesses say that he was composed and joyful. As he was led to the place where he would be killed, it was called Lollard's Pit. And as the fire was being prepared, he spoke the gospel to the people. He was led to the stake, and a chain was placed around his waist and a bundle of wood around his body. And as the fire was lit, it blazed up in his face. His face was the first thing to burn, they said. And he cried out, sometimes Jesus and sometimes Credo, which meant I believe. As the fire consumed his body, he fell forward and died, the first reformer to be burnt on English soil. William Tyndale was born sometime around 1490, a little more than a century after the death of John Wycliffe. We know that he was born around the borders of Wales, and no records exist of his school days or the kind of education that he had as a boy. We do know that he enrolled in Oxford in 1505. He grew up at the university. There, they did not look to Scripture for anything until they've been at the university for 8 or 9 years. And that's a Tyndale quote. That we were not allowed to deal with Scripture until he said we had been indoctrinated properly for 8 or 9 years. He graduated with his master's in 1515. And as a gifted linguist, he could speak 8 languages. One biographer said he could speak all the languages so well that no matter what language he was speaking, you would think it was his native tongue. Wow. Tyndale also took classes at Cambridge, and many believed he received a degree from there as well, although we don't know for sure. Something was going on at Cambridge around this time. Martin Luther's words were starting to be circulated and talked about by instructors and students. And it began to create excitement on campus. In this environment, Tyndale embraced the core truths of the Protestant movement and the gospel. In 1521, Tyndale decided to step away from academia to further his study of the Reformation. He also wanted to digest this new Greek Testament. He took a position working in tutoring for a wealthy family of Sir John Walsh. And it was during this time that he came to the conclusion that England would never be evangelized properly unless we had a proper English translation from the Greek. So he made translating the Bible into English his driving mission. And after getting no support from the Catholic Church, He actually tried to get some of the funds from the Catholic Church to do that. I guess it was a long shot, but didn't get any support from the Catholic Church to translate the Bible into English. He knew that he would have to leave London in order to get it accomplished. So he left London as an exile, a fugitive, and an outlaw, because they told him, do not translate the Bible into English. So he went to Germany. Here, apparently, he came under the influence of Martin Luther for a time. And it was here that he began work on translating the Bible from Greek to English. After finding someone to finally print the Bible, he went to Cologne. However, an enemy of the Reformation planned a raid on the printing press. He was told about it, though, and so he was able to get what had already been printed, and he was able to flee once again, running as a fugitive and an outlaw with his few English papers that had already been translated, and off he runs to the next place. Tyndale fled to Worms, where he would get 6,000 copies of his Bible printed. And in the spring of 1526, Tyndale began smuggling English Bibles into England in bales of cotton. By the summer of 1526, his mission was found out by church officials. Lasted a few months before they figured it out. Both the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Bishop of London were furious. So they made it illegal to buy, sell, or even handle Tyndale's Bible. But all that did was made the sales and the handling and the buying of it skyrocket. At this point, they began searching for Tyndale, and they made it their top priority. The Catholic Church's top priority in England during this time was to capture William Tyndale. He eventually found a safe environment at the home of the von Emersons in Hamburg, Germany. Here he could finish the Pentateuch, which he did in January of 1530. The Pentateuch is the first 5 books of the Bible. Here's what's interesting. Out of the 8 languages that he knew, Greek being one of them, he did not know Hebrew. So he taught himself.
Wow.
Taught himself Hebrew and then translated the first 5 books of the Bible from Hebrew into English. He eventually found, in 1530, he began shipping those into England as well. In November of 1530, Thomas Cromwell, a counselor of King Henry VIII, tried another strategy to sway Tyndale. He recruited Stephen Vaughan, an English merchant who was sympathetic to the Reformation, to find Tyndale. So he kind of used the guy as a spy. Tyndale never really trusted the king, even though multiple times the king told him, hey, you come back into England, we'll give you safe passage and everything will be fine. Tyndale didn't trust the king, so here's what he said. Okay, I'll come back to England, but if I come back to England and stop translating, you have to commission a translation. You start translating it, and I'll stop. The story of Tyndale's capture is one of betrayal. The king wasn't going to do that, so he didn't come back. There was a man by the name of Harry Phillips. He had been given a large sum of money by his father, and he was supposed to go pay off one of his father's benefactors. However, on the way to take that money to pay off the person he owed, he gambled away all the money. An unknown high official, they think it was the Bishop of London, found out that this man lost all his money and told him, I will give you more money than you lost if you will go find Tyndale for me. Desperate, the man agreed. He eventually found Tyndale, pretended to befriend him, and won Tyndale's trust. Tyndale thought this man was his friend. One day, Harry Phillips lured Tyndale into a narrow passage where soldiers were waiting to arrest him. And after 12 years as a fugitive, William Tyndale was finally captured. He was imprisoned for 1.5 years while his trial was prepared. He was found guilty and given the death sentence, as we can imagine. Tyndale was executed on October 6th, 1536. He was strangled, burned, and then his body was blown apart by gunpowder. His last words were powerful. Lord, open the King of England's eyes. The King of England eventually moved the Church of England from the Roman Catholic Church. As we'll see, the Church of England became an independent Catholic church. Is basically what they did. So they said, we're not going to be under the Pope's authority anymore. We're the Church of England now. Will be our own Catholic church with the King being the head of the church. Convenient that the King wanted to do that, right? Upon the death of Henry VIII, his son Edward, who we've already talked about before, who was sympathetic to the Protestant Reformation, took over, and many of his advisors persuaded him more and more and more in the direction of the Reformation and the true gospel. Two of these men were Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley. Hugh Latimer was born to a family of farmers around 1485. He attended Cambridge, and was elected a fellow on February 2nd, 1510, and he received his master's degree in 1514, and he was ordained as a priest in 1515. In 1522, he became the chaplain and the preacher of Cambridge University. He continued his studies and received a divinity degree in 1525. That's a doctorate degree. His final disputation, which I guess today would kind of be his final thesis paper, but they were all disputations, so they had to argue against something. His final disputation for his doctorate in divinity was to refute the ideas of the Reformation. At this point, he says that he was a staunch Catholic and dedicated to the papacy. However, as we have already said, the Reformation had begun among the staff and the students of Cambridge. And eventually, he began to attend a pub Bible teaching meeting led by Thomas Bilney. They met at a tavern called the White Horse Tavern. There, men like Bilney would share and teach the true gospel. Latimer would say that Bilney's teaching had a great impact on him coming to believe in the Reformation and Protestant doctrine. Nicholas Ridley, he was born to a prominent family in around 1500. Highly educated as a child. He eventually traveled to Paris to further his education. He was ordained as a priest in 1524, received a bachelor's degree and a Master of Arts degree by 1525, returned from Paris in 1529, and went to Cambridge. He spent the first 30 years of his life just getting educated. His turn toward Protestantism is really obscure. We don't know a lot about it. But it seems that as a brilliant student of the Bible, he moved in degrees more and more and more. So the time that he came to Cambridge, he had already rejected the papacy. He wasn't fully Protestant yet, but he had already rejected the papacy. And he said the reason why he rejected the papacy is because the Bible was clear there is only one that's the head of the church. So his move away from the papacy simply was he knew the Bible. He believed the Bible over anything else. After serving as a chaplain to Archbishop of Canterbury, I flipped too many pages. He would soon be made one of the king's chaplain under Edward. Meanwhile, Latimer, who was appointed Bishop of Worcester, continued to teach the Reformation doctrine boldly. He was eventually imprisoned under King Henry's reign, but he was released after Edward took over, and he moved into the king's court to tutor the Duchess Catherine of Suffolk. So here's what happened. Ridley and Latimer are now in the king's court together. Both these men have worked their way into the king's court. Both of them prominent positions in the king's court. However, that all ended the day that Edward died. Because we know who took over after Edward. Bloody Mary. She wanted to bring an end to the Reformation in England. She wanted to move England back to the Roman Catholic Church. One of the first acts that she did was to arrest Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley. After serving time in the Tower of London, they were taken to Oxford, September of 1555. There they were asked if they accepted the authority of the Pope and that he had the authority of Peter. They both said they did not accept the authority of the Pope. Latimer responded this way: Christ made one oblation and sacrifice for the sins of the whole world, and that is a perfect sacrifice. It neither needeth to be, nor can there be, and any other propitiatory sacrifice. I reject Catholic doctrine. Christ is the perfect sacrifice. He is the perfect sacrifice. This obviously was very offensive. They were both sentenced to death by hanging. And they were to be executed, hanging and burning, and they were to be executed on October 16th, 1555. Ridley was led out first on that day. And as he stood there, he watched as Latimer made his way to where they would be executed. He ran to Latimer and embraced him, and he said this: "Be of good heart, brother, for God will either lessen the fury of the flame or else strengthen us to abide in it." The two then knelt there and prayed, speaking to one another in hushed tones so that no witnesses ever knew what those two men shared with each other that day, as the bailiffs stood in the shade because it was a little warm. A message was then preached against the two men. They actually had a preacher come and preach to the people against the two men. And the verse that he preached from was, "Though I give my body to be burned, if I have not love, I am nothing." And he turned to the men and said, "They are nothing. They have no love for the Pope. They have no love for you. They're nothing." After the sermon, Ridley stood up and proclaimed, "So long as the breath is in my body, I will never deny my Lord Christ and his known truth. God's will be done in me. Well then, I commit our cause to Almighty God, which shall indifferently judge all." They were then tied to the stake, where Latimer gave his famous last words to Ridley. He turned to him and said, this is right before they die, moments before they're burned alive: "Be of good comfort, Master Ridley, and play the man. We shall this day light such a candle by God's grace in England as I trust shall never be put out."
Wow.
And here we are.
Yeah.
And here we are.
Wow.
Last man I want to talk about today is a man by the name of Thomas Cranmer. He was also arrested and executed under Bloody Mary. And he very, very well may have been the most important figure of the English Reformation. Thomas Cranmer was born July 2nd, 1489, in the small village of Ascleton, to a family of humble means. Cranmer was sent to school, but fell under the hand of a cruel schoolmaster. So much so, and the harsh treatment and the methods that he used, that Cranmer actually got to the place where he hated school. He hated literature. He hated it because of the influence. But he loved his father. His father taught him to hunt and to track, to shoot both longbow and the crossbow, and ride the roughest of horses. At the age of 12, Thomas Cranmer watched his father die. And it hit him hard. And his mother knew that the only way her son would be successful without a father is to make sure he gets an education. So at the age of 14, she sent him to Cambridge. This is a guy who doesn't even like studying. Like, he doesn't like education, and his mom sent him to Cambridge at 14 years old. So it's no surprise that it took him 8 years to get his bachelor's degree. Usually people got it in 3. It took him 8. But he didn't like studying. He didn't like school. So somewhere along the way in those 8 years, he ended up starting to like school because he stayed and he got his master's degree, which only took him 3 years. And he was eventually elected to a fellowship at Jesus College in 1515. Jesus College is a part of Cambridge. Sometime during this period, he married a woman named Joan. Now here's the problem in the Catholic Church. If you ever want to be a priest, guess what you can't do? You can't marry anybody. Well, he marries somebody. And technically he wasn't a priest yet, but that basically did away with any opportunity of him being a priest, so they kicked him out of school. He was forced to forfeit his fellowship, and his wife, just a very short period of time, was pregnant and died during childbirth. After she died, they readmitted him back into the school. Then he was ordained as a priest and received a doctorate of divinity in 1526. So this kid from humble means that just wanted to shoot a crossbow and shoot the longbow and ride horses and hunt and track and had no interest in education, eventually gets his doctorate in divinity from Cambridge University. Not much is known about his 3 decades at Cambridge, but we do know that he was a fan, that he was no fan of the Reformation. He was especially no fan of Martin Luther. He eventually was recruited by King Henry VIII to help annul his marriage to his brother's widow, citing that it was unbiblical. I shouldn't take my brother's widow. And her name was Catherine of Aragon. He decided to help. It was unsuccessful. He didn't actually get it done. But it made Henry VIII love him. You came to my aid. You've tried to help me out. He won favor with Henry VIII because of this. During this time, however, he was made the Archbishop of Canterbury, highest position in the Church of England outside of the king. And he was appalled that he got it. But you're not going to tell the king no, right? So he took the position. During this position as Archbishop of Canterbury, he now has an opportunity to mix and mingle all the time with other theologians and other bishops and other pastors. And as he does, the Lord begins opening his heart to reform doctrine and reform truth. And during the time that he was the Archbishop of Canterbury, he became more and more impressed with Protestants. And eventually he was won over. And you know how he sealed his position as a Protestant? He got married. Again, it's not something you do. He got married and kept it secret for 12 years. Thomas Cranmer was now a Protestant and the Archbishop of Canterbury. I don't think that's what Henry VIII had planned when he... It was during this time that Parliament passed the laws declaring that the Church of England was independent of Rome, making the king, instead of the Pope, its head. Once that happened, Cranmer declared that the king's marriage was void, and King Henry took Anne Boleyn as his new wife. Cranmer had no political aspirations, and he spent all of his time in the English Bible and trying to get the English Bible to churches and to people. He thought the same thing at Tyndale. If we're going to have a real reformation, we've got to get the Bible in the people's language. We've got to get it out to them. So he kind of made that his goal. He didn't care about winning over politics, all that kind of stuff. It was like, let's get the Bible in the hands of the people. In Henry's later years, things got dangerous for Cranmer. King Henry was never converted to Protestantism. And England was more like an independent Catholic church than they were a Protestant church. The only thing that saved Cranmer's life was that he had gained so much favor with the king in getting his divorce, or getting his marriage annulled, so that he could marry the woman he really wanted to marry. So he kept his position as Archbishop of Canterbury. We know the king eventually dies, January of 1547, and his son, King Edward, takes over. You know how old King Edward was when he took over? 11. So if you got an 11-year-old who's now the King of England, who's going to have a lot of sway or say-so in this person's life? All of the bishops and the tutors and the teachers, guys like Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley and Thomas Cranmer. This allowed Cranmer the freedom to really go full speed ahead at reforming the Church of England. So he began encouraging all the bishops and all the teachers to begin preaching Protestant doctrine. And he began publishing his own sermons so they could get out into the hands of the people. But Cranmer's greatest contribution to the Reformation was the Book of Common Prayer. This replaced Catholic liturgy that was in Latin with new English services. So now we're going to do church in English where everybody knows what's said. We've been doing it in Latin and nobody knows what's going on. Now we're going to do it in English so everybody knows what's going on. And so he put together the Book of Common Prayer to orchestrate the liturgies of the Church of England. This book became one of the greatest classics in English literature, and well into the 20th century, its phrases were still a part of the common language of English people. But as we have seen multiple times, King Edward dies at a young age, and Bloody Mary takes over. Around the same time that she arrests Ridley and Hugh Latimer, she arrests Thomas Cranmer, believing that he, more than anyone else, was primarily responsible of this move toward reforming and Protestantism. And when she replaced the English prayer book with the old Latin Mass, Cranmer protested, and that's when she went after him and arrested him. There's my opportunity right there. And so she went after him and she arrested him. He was removed from his position and he was put in jail. And every day, Catholic apologists would come and hit just a barrage of attacks on him, trying to get him to recant and denounce Protestantism and turn back to Roman teaching. They did not give him enough food. They put him through a great deal. And they did it for 3 years. After 3 years, his confidence and his faith were crushed. And Mary's men persuaded him to sign a series of 6 recantations, they called them. The first was that England should obey the Queen's religion. But each of the 6 became more serious than the last, with the last one being a denunciation of Protestantism as a whole. And he signed the paper. In exchange for his life. The broken man, 3 years of being broken, finally signed. Mary saw this as a great victory. I just caused the greatest Protestant in England to recant of this ridiculous doctrine. That's what she thought. I've got him. Mary made a big mistake. Because even though she promised, if you recant, I will spare your life, she planned to execute him anyway. On March 21st, 1556, Cranmer was led to his stake to be burned. However, Mary allowed him to speak in order for him to publicly recant in front of everyone. But Mary was in for a big surprise. In his famous speech, he repented of all his sins. Of course, they expected him to do that, right? They thought his sins were teaching Protestantism. Well, we're glad that you're recanting of all those sins. But he ended by repenting of what he calls his greatest sin when he denied Protestant gospel. The crowd erupted. Immediately he was grabbed and taken off, tied to the stake, and the fire was lit. However, as the flames began, he took his right hand, the hand that had signed his recantation, and he plunged it into the fire first, saying, "As my hand offended, writing contrary to my heart, so my hand will be punished first." And they said he left it in the fire until it fell off. And the whole time that his hand was burning, he said, "It has offended, it has offended, it has offended." And then the flames, of course, eventually caught and burned Thomas Cranmer alive. These men, these 5 men, as well as others, they led the way in reforming the Church of England. And eventually a group influenced by these 5 men called themselves the Puritans. You may have heard of the Puritans. The Puritans were called the Puritans because they wanted to purify the Church of England. They didn't want to break away from it. They wanted it fixed. They wanted it right. They were reformers through and through. They rose up under Queen Elizabeth. It was these Puritans and this Puritan tradition that came to Massachusetts Bay in 1630, bringing with them the Protestant gospel, wanting to establish a bright city on a hill. It is those Puritans who have given us our faith.
Amen.
We as Baptists are an offshoot of the Protestant Puritan movement in faith and in practice. So once again, we can see that these 5 men, these weren't just some people way off in another country that don't really impact us. We believe what we believe today because the 5 men that we just talked about. So we see how involved this English Reformation is impacting our lives 500 years later. I've heard it said that history is boring. Well, I, for one, am thankful for the Protestant history of the church that has impacted our lives for the gospel of Jesus Christ. Protestant history is truly God's story. It's His story. It's our story.